Hi, my name is Kristen Lampert, and I'm here at the Endeavor Summit to share how to hire smartly for an optimized team. I'm joined here with Pete Petrella, Managing Director of Executive Search at TalentRise, and I lead our talent consulting and coaching practice. Together, we lead and challenge leaders to imagine their executive leadership by accelerating growth through kind of the concept of curation. And we challenge all of our leaders with the thousands of entrepreneurs we've worked with over the years to elevate performance through talent optimization. So the question I have for today is, how do you know if you have a winning team? Is it your company's growth? Is it the revenue numbers, your client satisfaction, retention, engagement? Or is it just something you know in your gut? Like, you know when you have a great team because it feels like magic, right? Roles and personalities complement each other. The whole becomes greater than the parts, and performance soars. Looking back in your career, you can probably think about one or two teams where you just felt invincible. More often than not, though, we also know that there's times where you don't actually get that sensation. Something feels off balance. The team just isn't gelling. You're triaging interpersonal conflict. You're spending a lot of time kind of managing board dynamics. And sometimes it can feel like you're the only person leading the charge. We know as C-suite leaders that you know how to build great teams, but we also know that there's no scientific way to intentionally, consistently, and strategically design for high-performing teams. The odds of getting the right people and the right team to do the right work are just too low. And if you're anything like the CEOs we work with, they seem to spend a lot of time second-guessing their team players, oftentimes when they're still in the game. So we want to take some of that guesswork out of your work today by talking about team design. In this session, we want to introduce you to a science-backed understanding of how your current team dynamics can make or break your next strategic hire. We do this in partnership with Predictive Index, and as a certified partner, we work with clients to help leverage behavioral assessment data to help inform their strengths and blind spots as a team. Like most meaningful things in life, the first step starts with you. Self-awareness is really at the individual level. And when you think about what awareness is, I love to call up this study that was done by the Journal of Clinical and Social Psychology in 2003, where they asked 3,600 senior leaders, how self-aware are you? And guess what? 80% of them said, I'm super aware. Then they conducted 360 feedback reviews on every single one of those leaders with their families, friends, and coworkers. And we found out actually only 15% are. Self-awareness is a journey, and most leaders start that journey either too late or not at all. And it gets even harder when you're at the top of the food pyramid in your organization because people struggle to give you feedback. So that's why we use tools like Predictive Index to help us understand your work through 4 major drivers. And the way that we understand this is by looking at how people behave. And there's 4 major ways that we look at it. So the first is around dominance, and that is really your drive or desire to influence others, their people and events. The other is your drive for extroversion. Are you fill your cup up on social interaction, or are you kind of drained at the end of the day by it? The third is around patience. What's your drive for consistency and stability? And we know that entrepreneurs tend to be pretty low Ds, like this chart tells us that, hey, you love variety and you love to innovate. The fourth is that we know that the drive to conform for rules and structure really creates a sense of formality. And for some leaders, like in this chart, it's a low D, somebody who actually is really comfortable asking more for forgiveness than permission. But if you've worked with any of your finance team, you're probably seeing a whole bunch of people on the other side. Each of us have behavioral preferences and charts somewhere on this spectrum. And so what this gives us is a unique view of your natural tendencies and then how you can actually use that data to relate to others. So understanding those 4 key drives and reading a person's behavioral chart can be nuanced and takes time to master. That's why we also have these reference profiles that are kind of like a geographical marker to help you kind of understand what general neighborhood you live in. Each person may be either squarely in a particular neighborhood, let's say they're highly social, or they might be one that borders on the neighborhood of stabilizing or a persistent personality or behavior. The best way to understand all of this is actually to see it in action. So I've got 2 main examples for you today. The first is I want to take Daniel, for example. So he's actually the president of Predictive Index and is gracious enough to let us talk about him at this time. And what we know about Daniel is that he's super driven, very dominant, a bit reserved, fast-paced and somewhat intense, and he loves having those rules kind of structured. What we also know is that when it comes to his team, his team actually has their aggregate picture is a bit more extroverted, right? So they have a lower attention to detail. They love a brainstorming culture. They're probably not loving so much of a command and control style. So when we actually look at his team as a whole, what you can see is there's a couple key areas. One is, hey, compared to the rest of his team, he's way more aggressive. He's also going to just say what's on his mind, and he's going to demand a lot more data from the team than maybe their natural preferences are. What this means is that there's areas of misalignment, right? We know that those are kind of the key areas where we just have to pay attention. So is David a black sheep or a savior, right? It all depends on how you use this data. So you can write him off and say he's just not the right leader for the team, or you can embrace his strengths and say, hey, there's some real advantages to having him be this leader. The one is that he is going to push this team to think differently. The other is that he is going to probably get frustrated at the idea sharing and maybe what feels like a lack of momentum or movement in the team. And that's where we get to coach David and make sure that he knows he needs to think about how he shows up for his team differently so that that frustration doesn't become a toxic component of his team culture. So the main headline here is that there is no magic bullet for the right hire. We all have superhero potential. It's about recognizing the potential in others and finding ways to strengthen it at work. You can use behavioral assessments to illuminate your understanding of yourself and your team to either figure out what trade-ups or trade-offs you're making when you have a given hire. So the headline here is that every hire has a disadvantage and an advantage, right? And it's about leveraging the advantages that you see with that person for the benefit of the team. To take this up a notch, I want to actually share an example of an actual team we've worked with and how you can use these behavioral insights to align your strategic initiatives and team behaviors in a way that I like to think about as Moneyball for business, right? How can we actually understand some of the dynamics of our players in the team so that we can optimize our results? And this example is of a client. It's about $500 million in revenue. They're a senior leadership team. It's a very large team in a high growth professional services firm. And they are actively hiring for a COO. And so what we had sat down with is to try to understand a little bit more about their hiring needs and how their team's currently composed so we can add some more insight into that search. So the first thing to note in that kind of quadrant that you just saw is that there's kind of 4 main behavioral emphases, and each person in the team kind of sits somewhere in that spectrum. What we know is that, generally speaking, certain profiles are naturally more wired to do certain type of specific work, right? And so we look at each of the cultivating, stabilizing, exploring, and producing as being the general space. And then we've got these 3 folks, adapters, ultras, and individualists, who are kind of like the flexors. They serve as a bridge in the gaps between all those different areas. So there's a lot more science here, but I'm speeding through so you can get a clear idea of how we use this. So when we actually reflect this back to this team, what we learned is that this group is an exploring team. They're very outgoing, cooperative, and eager to work with each other. They have an active desire to learn, and they are super creative. You can see a lot of the people sit in that innovation and agility, that kind of exploring quadrant. When you have a high exploring team, here's what is great about them, right? We know that they love risk. They're good at making decisions fast and decisively. They think boldly and out loud. They need time to process. But what we also know is that when they're in crisis, they tend to exhaust each other with new ideas, and they tend to expand a lot of energy on the next thing instead of on what they need to produce today. And they may be creating some additional complexity because they're so used to deciding kind of in a more impulsive and gut intuitive way. So what we know, just knowing about this team and thinking about that COO, is that, hey, we need to advise this team to make decisions, not in the heat of moment, but give them time to think and stop trying to do everything at once, right? Prioritize just a few things, execute, and move on. And don't let the person with the loudest voice in the room dominate the agenda, right? So we learned that just about how this team operates. Now what's really cool is that we can put another layer of insight on this, which is about the competing values framework. So when you think about your strategy, we can add another layer. And I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on this, but Linda Applegate, a professor at the Harvard Business School, really set this foundation. And it's a pretty solid understanding of how you prioritize your strategic values and priorities. And so what we know is that every organization, when it comes to distilling it, can sit in one of these four kind of quadrants. And what we did with this client is that we took into account their key strategic needs, right? So what we learned is that they are pursuing an anchoring strategy, a strategy that actually weights a lot more on process and precision and team and employee experience. So what they recognized in essence is that, hey, we can't keep on innovating. We really need to look back internally to the organization, and we're hiring the COO so that way we can actually drive some more operational improvements. And what we see here in those purples, those are the strategies that they're championing. And it doesn't mean that they don't have enough people to champion it, because a lot of people can flex in different areas. But when it comes to making that specific hire, we want to make sure they're empowered with the right data. And so what we had is our new hire who kind of sat much more on the process and precision. Now, this has a lot of advantages. One is that we found a hire for the client that is an operator profile, very pragmatic, stable, and thorough. A lot of experience that we vetted on driving, stabilizing strategies and more process and technology improvements. But in addition to that, we actually were able to coach the team and the senior leaders to know that, hey, this person's going to feel a little different than maybe the rest of the team. And as we think about onboarding and coaching them through their first 90 days, how do we make sure that we celebrate those strengths, because that's what you hired them for, and not put them in a position where they're over-conforming? So all of this is really incredible insights and fun to do with our clients when we're helping them make these key strategic decisions. So the key to hiring smart for an optimized team, if you're taking anything away from this, is number one, cultivating self-awareness at every level of the organization. The more you know about yourself and the more you know about your people and how you impact them, the more effective you're going to be as a leader. And then number two, building in team dynamic discussions and taking the pause to just look at your own makeup can drive incredible insights, especially when it comes to making a strategic hire. So I want to thank you for today and welcome additional conversation. Love to hear your insights and feedback on today's session. And hopefully we'll connect in the exhibit room. Thank you.